What up, TCK Potters? I'm your host, Sky Guasco, joined always by my man, Lukas Kaser, and you are tuned into the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel at the Candlestick Kids, leave a rate and review anywhere you're listening to your podcast, and follow us on IG at fantasyfootball_TCK Pod and on Twitter at TCK_pod. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Episode 207 of the TCK Pod. Today we're going to be breaking down the wide receiver fantasy schedules. Then tomorrow we're going to get into our first round of official fantasy wide receiver rankings. And then on Thursday, we're going to be getting into a zero RB PPR strategy draft for our mock this week. We did the quarterbacks 2 weeks ago, running backs last week. Next week, we'll be doing the tight ends to finish up our month-long series. But before we get into the wide receivers, Lukas, how are you feeling, man?
Doing good. I'm ready to show everyone this week why you should be going running back, probably running back in the first couple of rounds of your drafts. The wide receivers are very deep. A lot of them have really good schedules, and I don't want to say schedules don't matter for their wide receiver, but to an extent, if it's a hard schedule, they're going to be a negative game script, so they're going to be throwing the ball. So I think that there will be a lot of RB-heavy mock drafts for me and hopefully you guys this year.
And we did that RB-heavy mock draft last week, and I posted it up on IG and Twitter and got a lot of feedback from it. Most people, I think, are starting to go that direction this summer, at least early spring, and seeing how things are going to develop. And you and I have been very consistent with the fact that you and I believe that, frankly, there's just more value at wide receiver later in drafts. And if you pass on those top-tier running backs, you may end up with David Montgomery and David Johnson as your RB1 and 2, which would be – that would be great if you're looking at Michael Thomas, Julio Jones, and, I don't know, Juju or something as your top three receivers. But if not, then you could be hurting. So I agree with you. But I've been doing a bunch of mocks on my own time and going zero RB just to see what happens. And I've actually been pretty thrilled with some of the, fourth, fifth, sixth round running backs I've been able to find. So now, the last couple of weeks we've been going over the best 10 schedules for the quarterbacks and running backs for the entire season. And then we've been looking at the 10 worst schedules for the season. Then we dive in deeper and we go into the best first 4 weeks. Now, with quarterbacks and running backs and potentially tight ends next week, I think that matters more so than wide receivers. Wide receivers for me, personally, and you can jump in here, wide receivers for me is you draft your guys, and if they blow it or they're terrible or get hurt, you just make another move. The waiver wire is usually stacked with wide receivers, especially mid to late in the season. Guys pop up, guys get opportunities from injury, whatever, where they don't at the or the running back position so much. And quarterback, of course, you can stream and tight ends as well. So for me, I know that there's some kickback on fantasy schedules in general and how important they are, how important they're not, frankly, for fantasy football. And I would kind of agree to a certain extent. However, as we talked about in the quarterback and running back issues, I do believe that there is value in looking at schedules at least because they can be kind of a tiebreaker when you're looking at players. To break down the list, we're going to show you some players that get even more of a nudge up your rankings or players that I've been on the fence on anyway. And now that we dig into our schedule, I'm fading them even more. Then instead of the first 4 weeks that we've been dealing with the quarterbacks and backs, we're going to actually jump into a brief look and preview of the fantasy playoffs. Now, I know that's way the hell out in the distance, and you don't draft based on playoff scheduling, but I do think it's important, and I learned a lot kind of jumping ahead, looking at those schedules. So before we get into all that stuff, Lukas, how do you feel about the wide receiver position specifically with fantasy schedules and NFL scheduling? And how do you wager that? You put weight on what wide receiver 1 and 2 matchups? Do you look at current cornerbacks and safeties? How do you actually break down wide receivers versus what we've done with the quarterbacks and running backs thus far?
Yeah, I think when it comes to wide receivers, or you could just say pass catchers in general, because some tight ends split out in the slot and stuff like that, I think it's more so the individual matchup. I know PFF has a good matchup database chart, whatever you want to call it. And it's say Mike Evans versus last year would have been Marshawn Lattimore or something like that. I look at that more specifically than they're playing the Saints. They're playing the Saints who allow 30 points to fantasy wide receivers because I think when it comes down to what I sort of realized last year, and this was like the first year I started like actually like realizing this. NFL defensive coaches are really stubborn when it comes to how they position their corners. They don't like Marshawn Lattimore, perfect example. We all know the Saints as having Lattimore, and then their other rest of their DBs are terrible. They're always signing in journeyman guys like last year was Janoris Jenkins, stuff like that. But when you see, I don't know, say Mike Evans moves into the slot, for example, you don't see Marshawn Lattimore transition into the slot with him because they're just like, I don't know, they don't move him in. Like, I don't know a single coach that does this. I think really the only one that I could think of would be like the Broncos with Chris Harris because he's primarily a slot corner. So we do see those scenarios, but I think I value the matchup more because the defense is like the coaches are just really stubborn. They're going to keep Marshawn Lattimore in his one spot, and then Mike Evans plays, say, the left side 80% of the time. You can kind of manipulate that a little more than just saying he's going against the Saints. They allow X amount of points per game.
Yeah, fair enough. I agree with you. And I think that, again, I think the issue more so is that you're talking about shadow coverage. And shadow coverage is when a cornerback or a safety follows a particular receiver no matter where they go. And there are shadow coverage cornerbacks in the league, but that doesn't transition to every single defense. So you're right. And now Chris Harris, of course, with the Broncos last year is now with Chargers. So it's like, that is a different thing. So what I appreciate about Pro Football Focus and their models is that they're looking at the current situation. They've broken it down for the current situation based on their projections for this year, not based on the latest trends from last year. If you get caught up in scheduling from last year's matchups, that's where it can get you in trouble because a lot changes from year to year. If you look at the projections from year to year moving forward, I think that's when you have a better idea of things. So let's dive into it, man. Things good on your side?
For sure.
Cool, great. And I just want folks to know. Listening in, we're having a little connection difficulty today for some reason. So if there's any issues or lags, please do forgive us. All right, man, let's jump into this then. Let's go with the 10 best. We'll start on a good note here. The 10 best, this is according to Pro Football Focus, the 10 best wide receiver schedules going into 2020. All right, I'm going to read down the list, blanket and who that pertains to, the wide receiver cores, and then we'll break down each one of them real quick, and then we'll look at the worst as well. All right, so the best off the bat, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I don't think Chris Godwin and Mike Evans needed any more help. They do end up getting the number one wide receiver matchups for the entire season. They have 12 top 10 matchups. The NFC South secondary, which is pretty rough in their own division. They also get Minnesota, the Giants, and Denver, which are plus matchups for them. So obviously Evans and Godwin would get it there. Number two, Detroit Lions. That's Golladay and Marvin Jones. They have 10 top 12 matchups, and nothing during the playoffs. We'll get to some of those matchups, how they pertain to later in the season. Number three, Carolina. 4, the Chargers. 5 and 6, Packers and Saints. Good for Adams and Thomas, obviously, who don't need any more help in the rankings. Pretty much the consensus 1 and 2. Then number 7, the Bears. Number 8, all 3 receivers over there for Dallas. Number 9, Minnesota. And number 10, the Pittsburgh Steelers with a hopefully younger, revitalized Big Ben Roethlisberger. So again, 1 to 10, Bucks, Lions, Panthers, Chargers, Packers, Saints, Bears, Cowboys, Vikings, and Pittsburgh Steelers. Of this list, Lucas, what stands out for you? Obviously, some great receivers have great schedules. That is going to give them a boost. But there's also some pretty average hit or miss receivers on here that might get a boost as well due to the schedule.
Yeah, I think that, like, the names you read, obviously, like, I can see if people are going back, it's a lot of top-end guys in general. It's not a lot of, I don't know, you could say, just throwing out, like, kind of like a mediocre, like, Giants. They have, like, a mediocre, a lot of wide receiver twos range, which works for them, but, like, there's not, like, Evans, Godwin, Adams, Thomas. They're not the big names. So I think that this kind of maybe solidifies that, but there are 3 that kind of give me sort of the edge on which side I like or not. So Allen Robinson, Adam Thielen, and Juju Smith-Schuster are 3 guys that I know I'm going to be high on compared to most people. I think, like, I was doing my first run of rankings, which you guys will hear tomorrow. Like, I have Thielen all the way up in, like, wide receiver 7 or 8. A-Rob's close to, like, the 12 range. Juju's, like, the 10. So I think, to me, it just makes it yet again, it's another – it's a not a decision maker. It's a – I don't know, whatever you want. I forgot what I called it. The further indicator. Yeah, so like this kind of sort of just helps me because like you think Juju, what's his worst fear? It's just the injury. So if I can just play with the injury of Big Ben, I don't have to worry about the schedule. Allen Robinson, as long as Nick Foles is efficient, like I think he's going to be, the schedule's there. Adam Thielen, as long as really the schedule's there in general, because he's the alpha receiver now. I think it's just very promising and just kind of secures my confidence in them. But besides that, like you said, it was just a lot of the top end guys, which to me really just shows that they're just going to dominate even more. And I guess like one thing to say too, since we mentioned how running back to start, I was kind of like thinking in perspective to how the draft board's going to play out. I think what we'll see, because obviously it's May right now and we're evaluating this, come June or not June, like July and August, I think we'll see gaps to where you can maybe attack the wide receiver in terms of where they're falling if running backs are rising too. So kind of like just an announcement, like don't just sit there and think, okay, running back when it's May, and come August there could be terrible ADP values. So I think there's definitely room to work with in terms of the sway of the ADP.
I agree, and that's a great call. And you're right. When you have players like Evans and Godwin and Golladay and DJ Moore and Adams and Thomas and Amari Cooper, you're drafting them in the first 2-3 rounds anyway. Most of those guys actually probably in the first, second rounds. But you're right. There are certain players that get a nudge. Also, some secondary names in that list of teams where I'm looking for value. Marvin Jones, Robbie Anderson potentially, who I'm starting to come around on kind of. Mike Williams, Anthony Miller, if you believe he'll stay healthy. Gallup and CeeDee Lamb. Justin Jefferson, rookie, of course, for the Vikings. And then potentially Deontay Johnson as well. They all get kind of that extra boost where they're all that kind of like sleeper status right now, like the 8th round, 10th round later. But I might reach around on those particular guys to make sure that I get them instead of just hope that nobody remembers that they're fucking in the league, because I want to make sure that I have those like dart throws with upside later on, just in case. So again, the schedule does not say, I don't look at this and I think all the best schedules are guys are going to draft, but it definitely does kind of give the edge here and there, which I like. So some top names that I don't see on this list right away: Tyreek Hill, Julio Jones. Some of those guys are players that I'm going to draft anyway, right? But they're not up here in the top echelon. But some of these guys might get a nudge if we're able to go that way.
And I have one more too. So I use the Sharp Football stats. So in that playoff stretch, the Jaguars have the second easiest pass. I know we touched on Gardner Minshew, pass D efficiency, strength of schedule, but then they have the second toughest actual strength of schedule based on 2020 win totals. So to me, that indicates, like I said, game script. If they have they're playing good pass defenses, but they're playing, bad pass defenses, good teams, they're going to be in a huge negative game script, it just seems like to me. So that's another spot you could target DJ Chark, whoever the wide receiver 2 is going to be. I know Chenault's probably the long term, but I mean, Chris Conley was startable some games. D.D. Westbrook's a really good PPR candidate. So that's another team that I know we touched on in the quarterback episode, but maybe DJ Chark is kind of – we'll probably talk about it in the rankings. There's kind of a gap of like the second year sort of younger wide receivers in the ADP. I think I find a lot of rankings in ADP of like DK, Terry, DJ Chark, Gallup. So I think that might just maybe push Chark up higher for you.
Cool. I dig it. Great point there. All right, man. So again, Bucks, Lions, Panthers, Chargers, and Packers, Saints, Bears, Cowboys, Vikings, Pittsburgh Steelers, all there. If we take a deeper dive on those teams, I just want to throw out a couple notes for a few of these teams. Again, starting at the top. So the Buccaneers, 12 top 10 matchups. That's huge, obviously. The Lions coming up next. They have 10 top 12 matchups, but that's before the fantasy playoffs, which we're going to get into in the back half of this episode. So I'll pause on them real quick. The Panthers have the number 2 schedule in the fantasy playoffs. They have the number 3 overall, the number 2 in the fantasy playoffs. I like that all the way through. The Chargers have the number 1 schedule in the fantasy playoffs, and they have the number 4 overall. I love that for them. And Justin Herbert, of course, coming in late. Adams and Thomas are pretty neutral no matter what. The Bears, number 8 in fantasy playoffs. So I know the Bears aren't sexy, but if Lukas is right and Nick Foles is actually efficient, A-Rob could have value for you all season long, which you got to love. And then the Cowboys and Vikings are kind of a wash. We know about them. And the Steelers, they have a pretty good schedule other than the Ravens and the Browns, who, of course, are in the division. They play twice. Other than those teams, they play pretty well, and they have the 9th best playoff schedule for fantasy receivers. So I like that a lot, man. Let's jump into the worst schedules here for the whole season, and then we'll flip on the backside, and then we'll talk playoffs overall. So let's turn the corner a little bit here and get into the worst schedules. So this is from 32, the worst, up to 23. We'll just do the bottom 10, if you will. So we'll start here with the Buffalo Bills. That's, of course, Diggs, Brown, and Beasley. The Cardinals with Nuke and Christian Kirk. Fits, of course, 2 in deeper leagues. Miami with Parker and Williams. The Jets with Crowder, Perriman, and Mims. The Bungles with A.J. Green, Boyd, Higgins, and Ross. The Patriots with Edelman and TBD. We got the Rams with Cup Woods, and Reynolds. And then we have the Redskins with Terry McLaurin. The Broncos with Sutton and Judy. And then the Texans with all their new weapons, Fuller, Cooks, and Cobb. So let's start at the bottom, and we'll work our way up here with the Buffalo Bills. The worst schedule for wide receivers. It's the most terrible, I should say, when you need them. Weeks 12 to 14, they get the Chargers, the Niners, and the Steelers. I don't like that at all. We already talked about Josh Allen a little bit. How do you feel about Stephon Diggs and him being that number one there, and John Brown and Cole Beasley each getting 100 targets somehow? But them, again, probably going to be a run-first offense with Zach Moss coming in as well. Do you have any confidence in the Buffalo Bills at all, frankly, with knowing that the wide receivers have the worst schedule?
Yeah, once they got Diggs, it's one of those teams where, I mean, you guys can do what you want listening to us, but, like, you should just not try and find value in the wide receiver core. I know we did an episode in the AFC free agency recap, and I gave a little, like, take on how I went through Diggs' market share, target quality, the deep ball accuracy, and then use that to sort of, I don't want to say compare to the OBJ situation, but it kind of is the OBJ situation, a run-first team, a brand-new wide receiver that has – I mean, Thielen is kind of the alpha, but has been like the predominant playmaker for his team. Comes to a team where they already have a guy that uses his skill set in John Brown. They don't need a target hog because they have one in Cole Beasley. So where does he really fill in? And since we're kind of on Diggs anyways, I can kind of give my sort of just like quick overlying stat that I think is just going to draw me off. And so all of his touchdowns last year were on deep balls for PFF. So 20 yards or greater from Kirk Cousins, who ranked like 5th in deep ball percentage, completion percentage. He comes over to Josh Allen, who was the league's worst starting quarterback out of like whoever played the most snaps on their team in deep ball completion percentage. So take with that what you will. Yeah, they could figure it out. But to me, a run-first team that could care less about how dominant they are on offense, and they've made that known by just getting more defensive players, I would just stay away from the Bills' weapons anyway. I think like the only one I might be taking, well, Josh Allen, obviously, but Zach Moss is really the only skill position that I'm kind of interested in just through his ADP, but I know Diggs' ADP will be high because everyone would just attach the name value. I know Brown as of now is lower, but I think Brown will eventually catch up, but you don't really want a second deep threat on a run-first team. It just doesn't make any sense. Beasley maybe, but, I mean, he's just a late-round flyer anyway. So with the tough schedule and kind of already my thoughts on it, I'm probably just going to stay away from my teams per se, but I could definitely see Josh Allen flipping some switch and figuring out with Diggs, but McDermott's not a creative playmaker really anyway, so it's going to be very cookie-cutter, and I don't really like that for a big playmaker like Diggs.
I'm with you, and to add salt to the wound, I guess, for the Buffalo receiving core is we mentioned last week that the Bills actually have the 8th best running schedule. So for Singletary and Moss and Josh Allen, frankly, they actually have more of an opportunity overall in real football stance to run the ball more efficiently against some weaker opponents up front versus passing, which are not a pass offense anyway. So I totally agree with Lukas. I'm not super excited about Diggs. I think Josh Allen will be fine as a quarterback because he's his own thing with his legs, and he's had 17 rushing touchdowns over his first 2 seasons. Even if he had 5 rushing touchdowns, which he's had 9 and 8 in his first 2 years, even 5, he would separate himself to a top 10 quarterback. Not so much worried about Josh Allen specifically, these receivers. I am also thing we mentioned here on the podcast a lot that I think is important. We saw with Odell Beckham last year, perfect example. I wonder about Nuke Hopkins to bring up next. First-year receivers with a new quarterback, a new scheme, a new system and all that stuff. I worry about it. So how quickly are they going to actually be able to get that camaraderie rolling with this funky offseason if we even have one? So I agree with you. Fading Bills in the pass game for sure. And again, like I said, 32nd overall fantasy ranking for wide receivers, dead last in the league. That's all season. 28th during the playoff run. So even in the playoffs, they're just as bad. Next up, we have the Cardinals, and then the Miami Dolphins. Not worried about Miami so much. I mean, they're obviously a question mark. The Jets aren't super sexy. We'll get to the Bengals, but they're more based on, like, what's Joe Burrow actually going to do? We don't know about New England because of Stidham, and are they just going to run the ball 40 times a game? I want to talk about the Cardinals, and then I want to talk about the Rams, and then the Broncos and the Texans here to round out the worst schedule. So let's talk about Nuke Hopkins, Christian Kirk, Larry Fitz as well, and Kyler Murray, of course. So 31st, so second worst wide receiver schedule for fantasy. And, it eases up for them in the playoffs, which is nice. I like to see that, but not looking very good for the entire season. Again, first-year system for Nuke, but second year for Kyler and this entire offense otherwise, plus Cliff Kingsbury. Obviously, Kenyon Drake's going to help out. How do we feel about these wide receivers and primarily Nuke Hopkins, who, is right now a first-round pick?
Yeah, I always come back to how the Cardinals shifted their offense last year. We saw – and then when everyone thinks David Johnson was bad, he was injured, a little older, but the system didn't – yeah. So the first, I don't know how many weeks, 5-6 weeks, they ran the strictly air raid that everyone thought they were going to do. They had the weapons. They had David Johnson. They had Chase Edmonds. They had somewhat of Larry Fitz playing quite a bit of snaps. They didn't have a tight end running the field at all. And then something changed, whether it was David Johnson getting hurt. Maybe they realized they don't have the wide receiver depth to run 4 receiver sets every single play, and they switched to a traditional offense. And what that means is basically they just didn't run a bunch of plays. They didn't spread the field with the receivers. They didn't attack vertically, and they started using Max Williams. I think that's why Kenyon Drake maybe exploded. I think I will probably touch on that more as the offseason progresses along. But I think that if they switch back to this air raid, which it makes sense to why they would. They just signed Nuke. Hakeem Butler is coming back from injury. Andy Isabella year 2. They lost. They got rid of Demir Bird. I don't even know if Trent Sherfield's there. They still have Keyshawn Johnson, who'll probably be their wide receiver 5, and Larry Fitz, who'll play the slot. It would make sense that they transition to the air raid. So if they transition to the air raid, I think Hopkins is, I don't want to say team switching proof, because he has to go down your rankings anyways. The market share is just not going to be there like it wasn't. He had a 30% market share last year in Houston. That's not going to happen. But if they switch to this air raid, which just means a lot of plays, the defense still sucks. I think he'll still be a top 5 receiver. But if they do whatever they decided to do at the end of the season, I'm kind of scared for Nuke, because when you think about what he was at the Texans, he was literally just the receiver. They would just throw him the ball. They would just pepper him with targets. But he was never running seams. He was never, I don't know, like he wasn't like he was dominant, but he wasn't like go up and get it a lot. He wasn't you make a play after the catch. He was just catch it, get a first down. Catch it, get a first down. They already have that with Larry Fitz. Yeah, they already have that with Larry Fitz. Christian Kirk's their deep threat. Akeem Butler's a deep threat. Isabella's a speedster. So I'm just kind of scared to see how this is going to play out, because we saw last year, even with, I mean, not even close to the wide receiver core they had last year, but they still didn't have like one receiver that would get a lot of targets. It was very spread out. So it's just kind of scary. But I think the ADP is respectable for where I think people are realizing that, and he's going in one QB leagues, middle round 2, where he should be going. I think right around the wide receiver 3 or 4, probably. He's my 5. So I think if I get him at the wide receiver 5, I'll probably take him in 1 or 2. But that being said, just like Diggs, be a little cautious with how you view this offense transition.
We're going to get into rankings tomorrow, so let's save like an actual conversation. But you said you have him at 5. I have him at 6. Who are your 4 ahead of him?
Well, this is very rough. So if you're hearing this, I don't have my rankings done yet. Just kidding. I have him at 6 as well. I did.
Oh, you do? Okay. So I have some version. Again, we're hashing these out, but basically Thomas, Adams, Julio, Tyreek, and I've got Kenny Golladay ahead of him.
The only one I have switched is Golladay. I have Godwin there. So
Godwin, Golladay, I've got those 2 switched as well. Okay, cool. I just want to get a gauge on that. We'll talk rankings tomorrow. Something to add too is like how quickly this can change. Nuke Hopkins was basically the Michael Thomas in fantasy preseason of last year. Like it was it was DeAndre Hopkins is the consensus number one wide receiver for fantasy rankings, period. And then Devontae Adams had a couple people, i.e. myself, who put actually him at number one, drafted DeAndre instead of Nuke, or drafted Adams instead of Nuke, and of course got burned. But then, of course, now he falls potentially out of the top 5 for people because of the new system. Now, again, we're not hating the player, we're hating the situation. As we always say here, Nuke is the fucking man. And in year 2 of this offense, and if they get going, he's probably top 3 again next year after the season if everything clicks. But because of the new transition, because of everybody else around him in rankings, I think he is going to fall just a little bit. So I agree with you there. Okay, cool. Let's jump into really quickly. Let's talk about the Rams. I know you love Robert Woods. I do as well. I love Cooper Kupp. He's one of my favorite wide receivers in the league in general. They have the number 29 schedule during the fantasy playoffs. I don't like that at all. They've got 26th overall. They have 3 top 10 matchups over the first 7 weeks. So this is a situation – I'm going to get into the fantasy playoff schedules here after this. But this is a situation where I might look to – if there's other positions, if I'm neck and neck with like Robert Woods and somebody else, right, in my rankings, I might look to draft somebody else that are going to get me to a better position over the next maybe like – let's see if I can pull one up here just quickly. I don't know if this would be adequate as far as rankings go, but let's just say Thielen and Robert Woods go somewhere close in drafts. I'm not a huge Thielen fan. I know that you're coming around on him. I want you to convince me of it during rankings tomorrow and figure this out. But for me, if I'm neck and neck, maybe I go Thielen, draft him, because I know he's going to be a beast while he's healthy, but I don't trust his health. Older, he can fade down the stretch, blah, blah, blah. I take Thielen for 6-7 weeks and he crushes. I think Robert Woods might struggle with that schedule, and we'll see if he's number one or if Kupp's is number one. And then maybe come week 6 or 7, Woods is struggling and Thielen's at his peak. I might look to flip a pair like that. You know what I'm saying? Where I'm looking at maybe Woods down the stretch and Thielen might fade off, kind of a thing. So just a rough example. I didn't really premeditate that, but just an idea of something where I am a little bit worried about these guys off the block, but if they struggle, you might be able to buy these guys lower than you were to have drafted them originally. So let's talk about Woods and Kupp really quick at 26th schedule overall and 29th during the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, so I don't want to I'm not going to say schedule proof, but I think the roles that they are projected to play makes them. They were like 2nd or 3rd in like team pass attempts last year. Well, Kupp's possibly manning down the slot. I know we touched on it with the whole Van Jefferson situation there, but I think that Kupp mans down the slot, and Woods is now his role last year and Brandon Cook's role. Like they didn't fill Brandon Cook's role, meaning Woods, who is basically the secondary deep threat, is now going to be that. So I think just on volume alone, I don't think I'm going to be moving them down necessarily. I might like 1 or 2 spots, but I think that I just think that they're so safe this year in fantasy with the way this offense isn't changing really. They're literally the only 2 receivers. Like I know Reynolds has the connection or whatever, but Reynolds isn't going to come in and take work from Woods or Kupp. And this defense is bad. Like they had the worst net change from defense last year to this year, so they're going to be throwing the ball a lot. So I think that I wouldn't worry about them too much. That being said, this situation with another team, maybe you would not another like a team maybe with less safe receivers, like the Dolphins. Maybe I know they're going to throw the ball a lot, but maybe the quarterback switch hurts players and stuff like that. So I think that this situation alone, I think it's fine, but others do be cautious of the Thielen sort of comp you gave or example you gave.
Cool. And we can jump right into, and I'm going to skip over your Broncos just for a second, just to get into the point of like maybe a questionable receiver core. Houston Texans, 23 overall. Now, what's interesting about Houston, and this is a good segue into the playoffs here, but they have the 23rd projected schedule overall, which obviously is, below the middle of the pack, but they have the 6th best during the fantasy playoffs. So this is a prime example of like, I'm, maybe fading some of these receivers, but if they struggle a little bit and stay healthy, i.e., Fuller, then I might be able to buy him for the cheap down the stretch, just like Deshaun Watson we mentioned during the quarterback episode, where the Texans straight up, we went over the schedules last time. The Texans straight up could be like 0-4 or 0-5, just with who they play and what's going to happen. If that's the case and everybody's struggling, you might be able to buy those players, those skill players, who we know Deshaun Watson's great. David Johnson could be too. Duke Johnson is free anyway, and those receivers are awesome boom or bust plays. You might get all of them for free come week 7 if they're all struggling, and they do have a top 6 schedule coming into the playoffs. So again, some like long-term mentalities of passing on them in the draft intentionally because of their schedule, but then keeping them on your radar, knowing that they might struggle and not be sexy, but then coming around on them in week 5, 6, 7, 8 when trades are really starting to pick up in your league, and earmarking and being like, look, Will Fuller was drafted as the 20th receiver. He's the 31st right now, but he's healthy. Dude, he might fucking come around and be top 10 the rest of the season kind of a thing. So just a thought there. Comment quick on the Texans, and then your quick thoughts on your Broncos. Obviously, totally retooled and nice and shiny new toy there in Denver. But, like, do you believe the hype with the 24th ranked schedule overall and one of the toughest schedules overall in the first 5 weeks? Again, they could seriously struggle out of the gate.
Yeah, I think the Texans they're going to be throwing the ball a lot. Their defense is bad. Same sort of comp to the Rams a little bit. I think that really with the Texans, you're just going to be taking dart throws as to maybe this draft you take Fuller, maybe this one you take Cooks, maybe this one you take Cobbs to see who has any fantasy value. So take that with what you will. Obviously, this could be like I think Fuller is matchup proof, just the way he's used. Cooks, if they use him right, kind of is mini Fuller, and Cobb plays the slot or should play the slot and just be a target hog. So we'll see. So I think they're okay just to take some dart throws on. And the Broncos, yeah, they have a tough overall win total strength of schedule, which means a projected negative game scripts. So if you're buying into the Pat Shurmur offense, yeah, I don't really think it matters too much. Sutton's kind of just a touchdown guy anyways, or just a big play guy. And then Judy is projected to be sort of the alpha target hog, you could say. So I think if you want to buy into it, go for it. I wouldn't let the schedule sort of phase you out of that, because if you're buying into 2 receivers that are going to be in a pass-happy offense, obviously you're buying into the pass attempts, which lead to fantasy points. I'm not too worried about it.
Okay, fair enough. All right, man. Let's switch gears a little bit here. So we'll go from the worst schedules again, 32 to 23, really quick to recap. This is overall projected for the entire season. Worst schedules, Buffalo Bills, 32, dead last. After that, going up, the Cardinals at 31, Dolphins at 30, Jets at 29, Bengals at 28, 27, Patriots 26, Rams 25, Washington Redskins, and then the 24 Broncos, 23rd strength of schedule, the Houston Texans for the entire season. Let's switch gears here and talk and preview the playoffs a little bit. Again, the previous 2 weeks and maybe next week, we talked about the first 4 weeks specifically because with running backs, guys get hurt, you draft, you might be able to flip and trade, and obviously dynasty is a whole other question, but for redraft and quarterbacks, maybe you're streaming. We talked about Daniel Jones, right? Daniel Jones is somebody that I don't think Lukas and I are going to be having any shares of on draft day other than a deeper league and redraft. Dynasty, again, totally different conversation. But a redraft, probably not going to be drafting any Daniel Jones unless he just falls and he's the 15th round and I'll just take a flyer on him to have him on my roster. But he is somebody that I might be picking up later on in the season if the schedule gets a little bit better down the stretch, right? Deshaun Watson, we just mentioned, terrible schedule to start the season. He could be struggling big time, but turning it around, you buy him on the cheaper. I can't imagine he gets dropped. But last year, Aaron Rodgers was on waivers. Jameis Winston was on waivers because of what happened. Phillip Rivers over the years, Big Ben Roethlisberger, Drew Brees even, I've seen on the waivers over the last couple of years because they have a 2-3 week stretch and people can't afford to keep him on their roster. Deshaun Watson has a shitty first 4 weeks and he ends up on waivers. He's a full fab buy, in my opinion, if you don't have another quarterback, because I think he can really turn it around for you. So something to be aware of. So let's dial it up a little bit. We'll go back to the best schedules. We're going to preview the best fantasy playoff schedules for you and let you know how Lukas and I kind of feel about some of these teams. Also, something I learned a lot from, and I kind of went in and I dug a little bit deeper. I'll give you the list of best and worst fantasy schedules overall, but also fantasy playoff schedules, I should say. Also, though, I did a little bit of extra research, and I looked at teams who have overall a good fantasy schedule, but is their playoff schedule that good, those particular weeks, and vice versa? Do they have a rough overall schedule during the season, but their playoff schedule maybe looks a little more juicy? So we'll go into that. I also want to preface this, that per this conversation, we're always talking full PPR unless we say otherwise. Also, the fantasy playoffs here on the TCK podcast until the league changes is week 14, 15, and 16. So if you're new to fantasy football or you're a commissioner for the first time in your league, please reach out to us and let us help you out with those responsibilities. But if it's your first time maybe, or you've been dealing with leagues who have had a week 17 championship, we highly recommend that you do week 1 through 13 as your regular season. Then you do week 14, 15, and 16 as your playoffs. Week 16 of the NFL season should be your NFL or your fantasy championship league. And then week 17, if you want to keep playing, maybe that's DFS stuff that you can get into before the playoffs. So highly recommend that. For this conversation, we're talking week 14, 15, and 16, specifically those 3 weeks as a bundle. All right, man. Let's dive into it. So the best fantasy playoff schedules projected, again, per Pro Football Focus, is the Chargers at number 1. They play the second, third, and fourth best matchups of the fantasy football playoffs. They have top 5 matchups in all 3 weeks. The Falcons, the Raiders, and the Broncos. Love that for the Chargers down the stretch. Next up, second, we have Carolina, 4th, 19th, and 1st in the championship. The San Francisco 49ers, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, number 4. The Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes. The Houston Texans is number 6. Philadelphia Eagles, number 7. Bears at 8. Steelers at 9. Seattle Seahawks at 10. We'll get into the worst here in just a little bit. Lukas, let's hone in for the best fantasy playoff schedules, weeks 14 through 16. What jumps off the page here for you on what teams we're looking at? Again, we have some serious wide receiver firepower on this list, 1 through 10. The Chargers, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for sure, the Chiefs, depending on how the Eagles stay healthy. We're looking at Juju and Deontay at number 9. Seattle even with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett at 10. How are we looking at here with the best fantasy schedules? And are we just kind of talking to talk here? Does this actually matter for you when you draft, or is this more of a like wait and see and then a trade piece later on in the season?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways you can take it. So I'll just start off with the Chargers. So the way you can take this is obviously this is weeks 14, 15, 16. If Tyrod is still the quarterback, say week 10 or say week 14, that means they're in contention, right? They're going to be in contention for a playoff spot. So to me, that indicates the team is clicking. So maybe you can buy into that. That's where Keenan Allen, you would think, would be going off. If Tyrod is in still by week, I don't know when their bye is. Let's just say their bye is week 6. If Tyrod is still in by week 7, that means the team is doing good. That means they're going to keep riding Tyrod. They're going to keep riding him and they keep winning. And then once they lose, Herbert's in. Herbert could also supply fantasy wide receivers we don't know. So I think it kind of brings up good points to maybe you just take Keenan Allen and ride it out, or maybe if Herbert switches to come in, people are going to be concerned that a rookie quarterback is the starter for the Chargers, and maybe you buy in and go get Keenan Allen or Mike Williams for the playoffs because it's an easy schedule. So I think that's a different way you could look at it. The Panthers, I mean, I'm just going to keep saying it. They're going to have to score points to win in this division. So just buy into it. I love Teddy in redraft and DJ Moore. Robbie Anderson, I guess. I'm just concerned in how they're going to use him and Curtis Samuel. They kind of play similar roles. So nothing too worried about there. The Buccaneers is also a great one too, because if we all are buying into Tampa Brady, as gross as that is to say, these are going to be some big games for them in terms of playoff run. The Saints, the Falcons will all be competing for the division, I imagine. So they're going to be looking to throw lights out, keep it coming on them. The Bears and Steelers are kind of in that same boat as the Chargers, I think. They're teams that I think that can hit that 7, that 4 or that 5, 6, 7 seed this year. So it'll be interesting to see what it plays out. But I think the main thing is you can use sort of really the new playoff system with the 7 teams with the 3 wild cards to the advantage. People might not be thinking about that in the back of their head. They might see that a team's in 8th place in the division and be like, okay, nothing of it. But you could look at it and see that, okay, say Tyrod's playing, they have a shot to hit the 7 seed. Maybe I go buy Keenan Allen for the fantasy playoffs and you ride the 2, 3, and 4 easiest schedule as of now. for a receiver that has been a top 10 receiver for the last 3-4 years.
I think that's a great call. First of all, the Chargers have a bye week in Week 10, and that's a perfect
Even better.
Barometer. Even better. So you get 10 weeks of Tyrod Taylor if he's healthy, and then if the Chargers are 5-5 or worse, it's Herbert's season for sure. But if they're 7-3 in Week 10, there's no reason to flop out for Herbert if Tyrod's healthy. So I'm with you there. Carolina, yeah, definitely coming around on Robbie Anderson a little bit. Our good brother Curly, who was one of the original hosts here on the podcast a couple years ago. He's been DMing me, Lukas, on the side hustle, always giving you props because you're the only person repping fucking Teddy B, and I just can't quite do it yet. And the biggest thing is like Robbie Anderson. I'm coming around on him a little bit because I'm starting to realize that he was actually coached by Matt Rule at Temple, which is helpful, right? Those relationships are always big time. So I like that quite a bit. And I don't know, there's just certain relationships when teams go out and get a guy out of free agency, it's not always just a matter of like, he's the best player available, we could use him. Like, there's a reason that Cam Newton is not on a team yet, but Nick Foles and Teddy Bridgewater and Jameis Winston were picked up before Cam Newton, who in a bubble, I think anybody would have any of the Cam Newton over all those guys. But he doesn't fit the system, the personality, the something else of those particular teams. That's why they went out and got their guy. So I think that matters. And Robbie Anderson, I'm starting to realize that he might be their guy in Carolina. Now, do I expect him to catch, 12 fucking 50-yard bombs a game? Absolutely not. I think he's Deshaun Jackson. And DJ Moore's the guy there. However, I do think he has more value than I was giving him credit for. And with the second best playoff schedule, Robbie Anderson's somebody that people are going to be fading big time, me included. But they have the third best overall in Carolina and the second best in the playoffs. So if Robbie Anderson's floating around, a high-end wide receiver 3 in Week 10, you might be able to wrap him into a trade package, pick him up for the playoffs. And if DJ Moore goes down or Curtis Samuel doesn't pan out again or whatever, or he and Teddy get some deep bombs going, Robbie Anderson could really, really add some huge upside to your weeks down in the playoffs. And we did know last year when Sam got healthy, Sam Darnold, Robbie Anderson started putting up like 3 of the last 4 weeks or somewhere over 100 yards. So that would be huge on your team, obviously. A couple other ones here. Again, something to note is that the Houston Texans, again, have the 23rd overall season schedule for fantasy, but they have the 6th best during the playoffs. Okay, they play the 8th best matchup, the 10th best matchup during the fantasy playoffs. So those are just, again, things to kind of understand while you're preparing for your draft. So to compare apples to apples a little bit with the best overall schedules and the best fantasy schedules, I've highlighted the teams who have a top 10 overall season schedule, and they also have a top 10 fantasy playoff schedule, because not all teams who have a top 10 fantasy schedule have a top 10 overall schedule, and not all top 10 teams have a top fantasy schedule. But the teams that have a top 10 overall schedule for wide receivers and a top 10 fantasy playoff schedules are, in no particular order, the Chargers, the Panthers, the Buccaneers, the Bears, and the Steelers. So those are teams that you can target early in your drafts with favorable rules, and that should last you, assuming the talent and the injury is clean throughout the season, and then might even benefit you even more so during the actual playoff season. Some teams that are kind of neutral in that top 10 bunch, the Green Bay Packers and the Saints, but of course you're drafting Thomas and Adams anyway, the Cowboys and the Vikings, the 49ers, the Chiefs, the Eagles, and the Seattle Seahawks are top 10 in one or the other, but not top 10 in both. I just think that's important. One team to mention, this is going to segue us into the worst fantasy playoffs schedules for the wide receivers. One team to mention, the Detroit Lions have an interesting schedule this year. They have the number 2 overall schedule for fantasy wide receivers, but they're number 26 during the fantasy playoffs specifically. So number 2 overall, but during the fantasy playoffs specifically, they play the 19th, the 20th, and the 26th fantasy matchup projected as of now going into the season. Of course, a lot of this can change, but that is something to potentially fade down the stretch. So, Lukas, let's change gears here. Let's jump into the worst fantasy schedules. I'm going to run down the list, and I'll turn it over to you. Worst fantasy matchups here. We're going to talk about those Rams again. 32nd, dead last in the fantasy weeks 14, 15, and 16. The Rams, 31st, 23rd, and 27th ranked matchups. The Jets, 27, 25, and 24. The Falcons, 28, 26, and 18. Washington Redskins, Buffalo Bills at 28. Cincinnati Bengals at 27. I mentioned the Lions at 26. New England Patriots at 25. Cleveland Browns 24. And Jacksonville Jaguars 23. Just like the best matchups. So what jumps off the page here for the worst matchups, specifically talking about weeks 14, 15, and 16 where you're going to need them the most?
Yeah, I mean, the Rams were the first one. Like I said, I don't think it matters too much. I think passing volume and the limited receivers in a good way, they're going to get a lot of volume, won't hurt anything. The Jets, I mean, if they keep popping up on here, what makes you want to draft them? Like, Crowder might be the only one I draft. Like, everyone's hyping up Crowder like he's like some undervalued asset. Like, yeah, because he just catches a lot of passes, but in that part of the draft where you're going to get him in like the 7th to 10th round, you don't need to be drafting safe floor anyways. Just risk it for upside. So, yes, he's an undervalued asset, but he's undervalued for a reason because there's so many target hogs that are on better teams. The Falcons, I mean, I'm just going to throw that one out. They're going to have to score points. So if you're buying into them, don't let a schedule and numbers just throw you away from that. The Redskins, which I don't remember if we mentioned it on the worst. So Terry McLaurin, I think, is interesting. I love him in Dynasty, but I think the love's getting out of hand in redraft. I think that people are like, I mentioned the whole like pocket of sophomore receivers: AJ Brown, DK Metcalf, Terry McLaurin. Chark's not, but he is in terms of when he broke out. Gallup's not a sophomore, but kind of when he broke out. I think there's a good chunk where you can really manipulate the ADP and sort of find a lot of value. And I think I love Terry in terms of dynasty, just like I said, but I think like he showed off last year in like 4 games and the rest of his games sucked. So I know he can do it, but I don't want you to buy into it too much because, I mean, who knows? Is the quarterback going to be Kyle Allen, Dwayne Haskins? Their O-line is still – they literally did not draft a single O-lineman and got rid of Trent Williams. Actually, sorry, Sadiq Charles in like the 6th round. Doesn't really matter. The defense is great. The front seven's great. The corners are awful. So it's just going to be, I think, a landmine of really what's going to happen. I know Rivera's a good coach, and he might be able to do a lot of things with McLaurin, but they also have like 7 running backs in the backfield, so I don't really know what's going to happen. So I'm not saying fade McLaurin, but I'm saying don't buy into the ADP rise because with him rising, DK Metcalf's falling, and they're literally going to put up the same stat line just like they did last year. So I think it's kind of an interesting player to analyze as of right now in May. Buffalo's on there again. You already heard my take. Cincinnati, I think it is what it is right now. I don't really know if there's much to evaluate. I think if you just got to make the decision if you want to risk the new quarterback and sort of young offense. Detroit, you mentioned, I think they're literally just another Rams. They're gonna be competing for the division. They throw the ball as it is. They have 2 non-workhorse running backs, which is a good thing, but it's a good thing for regular football, but it's also a good thing for the receivers. They get lots of volume. It's a really good offense. The O-line's fine, so I don't really know if the schedule matters too much. Then the Patriots are on there again. I mean, just take Edelman. Don't think Brady's going to hurt Edelman. You'll see where I have him ranked tomorrow. I might be a little high on him, but I'll give my full explanation tomorrow. But yeah, I think really McLaurin and the Jets are really the only one. I think McLaurin's the big one. I didn't really realize how bad his schedule was just in general, but I think now that I kind of baked in the ADP to the schedule analysis and really I guess another note is when people look at I think the ADPs, you can look at ADPs and realistically say in your head how much better or what stat line can he put up compared to last year. Because I think people make rankings fine, but they don't really like take into consideration the final stat line that they're going to put up compared to the other guys. They can say that this guy has a lot of upside, but what does that upside mean compared to X player or something like that? So I think it's just another way to look at ADP and how you can evaluate schedules and wide receivers in general.
I agree. As far as Terry goes, Terry McLaurin, he only has 5 top 10 wide receiver matchups on the entire season. That's out of 16 games. Not good, obviously. I'm worried about Jameis, I always call him Jameis because he reminds me of Jameis, but Dwayne Haskins, right? Assuming he's the guy. Kyle Allen is there too with like whatever. And, again, I think that Ron Rivera is going to have that young team running the ball a lot. So, Terry, I'm also going to fade there. Joe Burrow, we'll see what he can do. I love the Bengals moving forward. I think I'm going to jump on the bandwagon, I think probably this year because they're still going to be bad. And that way, by next year, when they go 500 and the year after that, when they make the playoffs, I can be ahead of it. So I think I'm going to jump on this year, eat it. Kind of like the Browns. You know what I'm saying? I jumped on the Browns last year.
Yeah, a little different.
A rough season. Back on this year, another rough season. But after that, it's going to be, Bengals and Browns all day. I am concerned about the Bengals overall. I love me some AJ Green. I'm trying not to super fucking hate him like everybody else does. Love T. Higgins. Tyler Boyd, I'm fading a little bit just because I think the hype is too high when AJ Green comes back. And John Ross just is unreliable. But I do think that this overall offense, which is exciting on paper, but similar to the Cardinals, who we mentioned in the previous segment with the 31st, they're kind of high-flying, up-and-coming, young quarterback, young coach, young receivers, all this shit, seasoned veteran, all this. The Cardinals are 31. The Bengals are 28 overall. The Bengals are 27th in the playoffs. So I'm not going to be fading all Bengals. I just think that Joe Mixon is that offense right now with all those other weapons. So I'd rather just put my eggs in that basket personally. They also have a rough division. They placed the Ravens, the Browns, and the Steelers secondaries twice each. So that's 6 games where they're facing arguably a top 6 secondary 6 different times. So I don't like that very much either. And as I mentioned, the Lions 2 overall, but 26th for the playoffs there. So, all right, man, we have kind of broken down the best overall, the worst overall, the best in the playoffs, the worst in the playoffs. Some teams, again, I'm going to highlight quickly the worst overall and then the worst in the playoffs and then make some matches. But I want to kind of wrap this episode up with your overall thoughts on maybe how important a wide receiver schedule is overall, knowing what we know. Guys like Terry McLaurin have now popped off the page of oh, shit, I was kind of feeling him off of a big good rookie season, but now I look at the schedule. Now I don't know about Dwayne Haskins, blah, 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 new coaching. And then I'm like, oh, man, I love Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones, but their playoff schedule's 26th. I'm not excited about that. The Rams, whatever. We love the Rams, but their schedules are bottom 10 in both sections. How do you overall feel? I'll give you a couple minutes to collect your thoughts on it. I went through again, just like I did on the best schedules overall, and for the playoffs, I did it for the worst as well. And this is really when I compare apples to apples. Here's where I actually get my knowledge when I break this down on the spreadsheets. So teams who have a bottom 10 overall schedule and a bottom 10 overall playoff schedule, week 14, 15, and 16. That's the Buffalo Bills, the New York Jets, Cincinnati Bengals, New England Patriots, LA Rams, and the Washington Redskins. The kind of the only positive light on this side is, again, the Houston Texans have the 23rd worst schedule overall, but they do have the 6th best in the playoffs. So the Lions and the Texans are the only teams that have a good start and a bad finish, or a bad finish and a good start. Everybody else is pretty wash. The other teams in a neutral script, if you will, the Cardinals, the Dolphins, the Broncos, the Falcons, the Browns, and the Jacksonville Jaguars are kind of neutral there. So, Lukas, again, how do you feel about the wide receiver schedules overall, and what takeaways now do you get when you're drafting wide receivers, taking their consideration overall through the season and specifically for the playoffs?
Yeah, I think to kind of give a final how I would evaluate it. So one, negative game script, but to an extent not too outlandish negative game script. Like I said, the matchups, which are on PFF, which is a paid platform. If you want a discount of that, you'll need to buy into our packages because I will have that. So I will translate that information, not directly copyright, but in a way to where it's usable without just random numbers. Air yards, the same exact thing. That does matter. Air yards allowed by defense, air yards allowed by the player. It's another thing that we'll have on the in-season packages. And then the last thing is really, when it comes to negative game script, the other competition in the skill position group, you could say. So like I said, the Rams, their schedule is terrible. The O-line's okay. But the pass attempts and the lack of I guess there's a lot of vacated targets and a lack of people to fill those vacated targets. So I think it's kind of another way to evaluate the wide receivers. But I think if to narrow it down to the big two, which I think people realized last year, it's just the individual matchup in air yards, I think, are king to evaluating. That's where I found guys like Devontae Parker, Preston Williams, Zach Pascal, Mike Evans in boom games. Obviously, you're going to start him every game, but the games when he played against the really bad matchups of the air yards is where he kind of had the 45-point game. So I think those are my big two. You can buy the packages yourself, or you can get our in-season package, which should be out July 6th with more information as to what that exactly is, will be entailed in the next month or so.
Absolutely. Love it, man. Right on. Well, let's get out of here. That is the wide receiver fantasy breakdown for the schedules. Again, tomorrow we're getting into our first set of rankings on the season officially. And then on Thursday, we'll break down a 0 RB PPR fantasy mock draft as well to give you an idea of what it looks like when you go wide receiver for the first 3 rounds minimum. Maybe 4, maybe 5. We'll see what actually happens with that draft breakdown. Make sure to keep tuning into the Candlestick Kids Fantasy podcast. Appreciate all your support so far. I have started getting some DMs, and people are starting to reach out to us on multiple platforms about, the TCK Pod Listener League. We have some returners from last year starting to reach out to us, asking questions about, how we're going to do that league. Lukas and I are still kind of grinding on that. We will get you information as soon as possible. He and I have a bunch of different thoughts. We're trying to make it fun, trying to make it different. And we will be disclosing that to you as soon as possible. What I can tell you is that registrations for the league and submission applications will open up coming up in July. So make sure to stay tuned for that and more information. And as Lukas mentioned, coming up around the corner next month, now that we're already in June, next month we're going to be dropping our first draft guide officially. And there's a lot of draft guides out there, and we understand that all of them bring different sets of value. What Lukas and I do behind the scenes, a lot of you appreciate the collection of data, how we go so deep analytically. We can take you behind the scenes on how we actually collect this data, where we get it from, how we interpret it, and things like air yards and ADOT are something that Lukas prides a lot of his research on. But why? What does that actually mean? Where do the numbers come from? How do you actually turn that into your rankings? How do you turn that into drafting a player or staying away? That's the kind of stuff you can find in our draft guide. We're going to be dropping in July. So please make sure to stay tuned over the next week or two. We're going to be dropping pre-orders for that. So you can make sure to wrap it up there. And that also may or may not have to do with your early submission automatically to the TCK Pod Listener League. We've got a lot of things in the pipeline, folks. Appreciate you sticking with us. We know that, the world is a tough place right now, and we're hoping to provide some value and provide, some light within the darkness. So we appreciate you tuning into us, and make sure that you subscribe here to the channel so you don't miss any new videos coming up throughout the summer. Make sure you leave a comment on the schedules, players we might have changed your mind on, better for worse. Also, follow us on Instagram at fantasyfootball_TCK pod, on Twitter at TCK_pod. Join our Facebook group, the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast page. Of course, you can listen to us anywhere you listen to your favorite podcast. Leave us a rate and review there. And check out our rankings, which are going live position by position as we cover them on our website. More articles available, more information coming up on our website. Make sure you get that information while you still can. tckpod.com. tckpod.com. A lot of information. We appreciate y'all so much. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast. With Lukas Kaser, I'm Sky Guasco, and we are out of here.